My name is Paige Mercer. I was 25 the night my parents invited me to an expensive dinner to tell me the truth they had hidden my entire life, that I was adopted. My mother smiled as she calmly admitted they had only kept me because the adoption came with financial benefits, and now that I was no longer useful, they didn't need me anymore. My father quietly slid a stack of legal papers across the white tablecloth. They had already signed everything to cut me out of their lives and out of every future inheritance. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. For nearly a full minute, I couldn't say a single word. But there was one thing neither of them knew. 6 months before that dinner, I had secretly found my biological family, and that very night, I had invited them to the same restaurant. They were sitting just 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She simply hadn't turned around yet. What happened the moment she finally looked over her shoulder is the reason I'm telling this story 6 years later. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we share powerful, true-to-life family stories about betrayal, dignity, second chances, and the moment someone finally stops shrinking to fit a place they were never truly wanted. If you've ever questioned where you belonged, this story is for you. Leave a comment below, subscribe, and let's begin. The restaurant was called Adventure, and despite all the years I'd been part of the Mercer family, I had never once been taken there. My mother chose it herself, and that should have been my first warning because Diane Mercer never spent money on me unless there was a reason she expected to benefit from. She wore the gray cashmere sweater she reserved for funerals and corporate meetings, while my father, Wesley, booked the reservation under her name instead of mine. I noticed when the hostess asked whose reservation it was, and he answered before I even had the chance. There were no balloons, no birthday decorations, no cake waiting in the kitchen with my name written across it. For a birthday dinner, the table felt strangely empty, and the silence between my parents carried the cold precision of 2 people preparing to announce a verdict instead of celebrating their daughter. I had spent the last 4 years working in rooms exactly like this, arranging private dinners for clients, business negotiations, estate signings, and family meetings where someone had died and fortunes quietly changed hands. I knew the difference between a celebration and an interrogation. This wasn't a birthday dinner. It felt like a deposition. So I did what I always do whenever a room suddenly turns cold. I slowed my breathing, studied every detail around me, and counted every exit. That's when I noticed the small brass table marker behind us. Table 9. For reasons I couldn't explain, I memorized it, the way you instinctively remember a landmark before realizing you'll eventually need it. Then I placed my own belongings beside my water glass, including a thin manila folder that looked completely ordinary. My mother glanced at it and dismissed it without another thought. She probably assumed it contained work papers, a resume, or a birthday card. She had absolutely no idea what was actually inside. To understand why none of this surprised me, you have to understand what birthdays looked like in our house. When I was little, my birthday meant a single candle. Not because it was a sweet family tradition, but because one lonely candle was all my mother ever bothered to stick into a stale grocery store cupcake she grabbed on the drive home, usually warm because she never even remembered to refrigerate it. I'd watch that cupcake sweat on the kitchen counter while my mother stepped away to answer a phone call. 3 weeks later, my cousin Brett celebrated his birthday with a rented bounce house, a professional caterer, and tiny quiches served on silver trays. Brett was Aunt Renee's son. And more importantly, Brett was blood. I still remember turning 8 and asking if I could have a birthday party too. My aunt was sitting at the table sipping my mother's wine, and she answered before Mom even opened her mouth. "We can only afford one special celebration each month, sweetheart," she said with a warm smile. That was the moment I learned one of life's hardest lessons. People can sound incredibly kind while explaining why you deserve less. So I learned the math early. One cupcake costs far less than a birthday party. A child who asks for less is cheaper than a child who expects to be treated the same. By the time I turned 9, I stopped asking for cake altogether, because I could see it made the calculations easier for everyone at the table. And being easy felt like the only value I had. I never told myself it was heartbreaking. I convinced myself it was practical. That's the cruel thing about growing up only because you're useful. You never realize you've been assigned a price until someone finally says it out loud. And sitting across that white tablecloth at Vanterre, 25 years old, I could feel my mother preparing to name mine. I left the Mercer house the week I turned 18 with nothing but 2 duffel bags and a community college acceptance letter I had completed on my own. No one drove me there. No one helped me pack. I worked nights behind a pharmacy counter, attended classes every morning, later transferred to a state university, completed my paralegal program, and waited tables on weekends to pay every bill myself. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Not because it makes me extraordinary, but because it matters for what happened later. Nobody handed me anything. By 25, I had become a respected paralegal at a downtown trusts and estates law firm, and I was good at what I did. Every day I worked with other people's wealth, organizing what would happen to their lives after they were gone. I drafted the quiet legal documents that determined everything: beneficiary designations, inheritance distributions, trust provisions. The overlooked pages that decide who receives security and who is left with nothing long after the funeral flowers have faded. I could read a trust agreement the way most people read a face, and the greatest irony of my life, the one I couldn't laugh about for years, was that I knew exactly how to build perfect legal boundaries for complete strangers, while I had never learned how to build one for myself. I could tell a grieving widow exactly what she was legally entitled to, and exactly what she wasn't. I could explain trust documents, inheritance rights, and estate laws with complete confidence. But for the life of me, I couldn't make my own family want me. The only person I ever truly called family was my grandmother, Nana Ruth. Every Sunday at exactly 4 o'clock, without fail, I'd call her, through college and long after. She always answered the phone as though she'd been waiting all week just to hear my voice. Looking back, something Nana once told me became the single sentence that changed everything. Nana Ruth Mercer was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in that family who ever treated me like a person instead of an obligation. She had strong opinions about everything and never apologized for speaking her mind. When I was 12 and crying in her kitchen because my cousin Brett told me I wasn't a real Mercer, she gently lifted my chin, looked me in the eyes, and said the words I carried with me for the next 13 years. "You were chosen. Sweetheart, not collected." Then she made me a grilled cheese sandwich, poured me a glass of tomato soup, and let me stay up far later than my parents ever would have. Nana passed away when I was 23, 2 years before that unforgettable dinner. At her funeral, I gave the only eulogy that celebrated who she was instead of focusing on what she left behind. Within weeks of her passing, my parents quietly moved out of their old split-level home and into the larger house on Linden Road, the family home that had always been connected to Nana in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I was grieving too deeply to question it, but during one of our final Sunday phone calls, when her voice had grown weak and fragile, she told me something that stayed buried in the back of my mind. "I made sure you'll never have to ask anyone for your own life." At the time, I thought it was simply a grandmother encouraging her granddaughter to be strong and independent. I had no idea she meant those words literally. 6 months before that dinner, while researching county property records for an entirely unrelated case at work, I discovered documents that proved Nana had already put her promise into writing, signed, notarized, and legally protected years earlier. Around the same time, my family began acting strangely, not loudly, quietly. The kind of silence that tells you something is happening behind closed doors. Text messages that once received replies within an hour suddenly went unanswered for days. Phone calls became shorter, invitations disappeared, and every conversation felt like people were carefully choosing words they didn't want me to question. I didn't know it yet, but they were preparing for the dinner that would change my life forever. My mother slowly stopped including me in family plans. First, she left me out of the holiday group chats, then acted surprised when I showed up to Thanksgiving without bringing the side dish no one had ever asked me to make. Meanwhile, my Aunt Renee started using one word over and over again in the family chat, a word she'd never emphasized before. Blood. This is a blood-only weekend at the lake. The cabin only sleeps 8, so we're keeping it to blood family this year. You understand, right? Oh, I understood. I understood perfectly. What I didn't understand, at least not yet, was why? The temperature in my family had suddenly dropped all at once. Families usually grow apart gradually. This wasn't distance. It wasn't coincidence. It was coordinated. The analytical part of my brain kept noticing the pattern, the same way you notice 3 unrelated invoices arriving on the same day and suddenly realize they aren't unrelated at all. Then one evening in March, my phone lit up with my mother's name. The warmth in her voice was several degrees warmer than it had been in over a year. Instead of feeling loved, I felt something much colder, the quiet click of a lock turning somewhere I couldn't see. "Honey," she said, using the nickname she only ever used when she wanted something. "Your father and I would love to take you out and celebrate your 25th birthday properly, the way we never really managed before." Every instinct I'd developed after 4 years of reading wills, trusts, and family disputes whispered the same warning. This is too perfect. Most people misunderstand my mother. They think her cruelty is loud. It never was. Her cruelty lived in careful planning. It was the woman who couldn't be bothered to buy me a birthday cake, suddenly reserving a private table at Van Ter and calling it a celebration. Diane Mercer only became generous when some invisible calculation convinced her the investment would eventually pay for itself. I'd watched that pattern my entire life. I had simply never realized that Ainur was the investment. So I smiled, thanked her sweetly, the way she'd taught me to, and accepted the invitation. Then I hung up the phone and sat alone at my kitchen table for a very long time, doing what I always do. I built a timeline. I thought about the house on Linden Road. I thought about the sudden obsession with the word blood appearing in every family conversation. I remembered the promise my grandmother had made shortly before she died. And finally, I looked at the plain manila folder sitting inside my work bag, the one I'd quietly assembled 6 months earlier after discovering the truth about where I came from. I never called my parents back to ask questions. I never warned them that I'd already searched the county records. Instead, I made a few phone calls of my own. Quiet calls. Careful calls. The kind you make when you've decided you aren't going to walk into someone else's trap. You've decided to be ready before they spring it. I'm not going to tell you who I called just yet, but I will tell you the lesson Nana taught me without ever saying the words out loud. Whenever my mother suddenly became kind, someone sitting at the table was about to lose something. I simply made sure that this time, it wasn't going to be me. Most people think stories like this are about money. They aren't. They're about truth, and who controls it. People usually assume a story like this is about money, and I understand why. Somewhere there's a will, a house, legal papers spread across a restaurant table. But as I sat alone in my car in the Van Ter parking lot that night, the engine silent and my hands resting steadily on the steering wheel, the thing I was truly afraid of losing didn't have a price tag. I was terrified of losing the last fragile belief that I had ever belonged anywhere. As cold as the Mercer house had always been, as transactional as every birthday candle, every holiday dinner, and every carefully measured act of kindness, it was still the only family story I'd ever known. They were still, technically, my parents, and if they cut that final thread tonight, the way every instinct told me they intended to, I would become exactly what my cousin Brett had called me when I was 12. Not a real Mercer. Just a girl someone picked up when it was convenient and put down when it wasn't. That was the wound they had spent my entire life pressing on. They believed it would finally break me. What they never imagined was that the wound had already healed. 6 months is enough time for that to happen when the right people finally find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat, tucked it beneath my arm, and walked across the parking lot with the calm confidence of someone who had already read the final chapter of a story everyone else still believed they were writing. I wasn't walking into a dinner where I would be disowned. I was walking toward a goodbye I had already chosen. They simply didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anyone said anything honest. My mother complimented the wine list. My father filled the silence by telling a parking story he'd already repeated twice on the drive over. Then, somewhere between the breadbasket and the entrees that none of us would ever finish, Diane folded her hands neatly on the table and slipped into a voice I knew all too well. The same calm, practiced voice she had once used while returning one of my Christmas presents right in front of me because, according to her, it wasn't practical. "We've always done our very best for you," she began. Wesley nodded a half-second behind her, exactly the way he had nodded behind every decision she'd made for the last 30 years. "We gave you a home. We gave you an education, more than many children ever receive." I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I simply rested one hand on the plain manila folder beside my plate and watched my father's eyes drift toward it before quickly looking away. He had no idea that everything he believed was about to happen was already falling apart. The label on my manila folder was typed neatly, with only the first 4 letters visible above my fingers. My father noticed it immediately. His eyes drifted toward the tab, then back to my face, curiosity settling in before he even realized it. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it, but to let him wonder. And I watched that uncertainty begin to work on him. Across the table, my mother continued her speech about sacrifice, responsibility, and everything they had supposedly done for me. As she spoke, I couldn't help thinking about the countless birthdays marked by a single grocery store cupcake, one lonely candle, and the quiet lesson that asking for less made me easier to keep. I stayed silent. Then she paused, lifted her wine glass with practiced precision, took a slow sip, and set it back onto the white tablecloth. Her expression told me she had rehearsed this moment many times. Finally, she delivered the line she believed would shatter me forever. "There's something you should have been told a long time ago. Paige." She looked directly into my eyes before saying, "You're adopted." Her voice carried the same casual tone someone might use to announce a change in dinner reservations. "We adopted you as an infant. You were never biologically ours. We never intended to keep it from you forever." She watched my face carefully, waiting for tears, panic, or disbelief. This was the climax she had planned the entire evening around. The elegant restaurant, the expensive cashmere sweater, the carefully chosen words, all arranged for the moment her adopted daughter realized she had never truly belonged. And yes, the words landed. No matter how prepared you think you are, some part of your heart still expects the ground beneath you to remain solid. For a brief second, mine disappeared, but what my mother didn't know was that I'd already discovered the truth 6 months earlier. The only revelation she gave me that night wasn't that I was adopted. It was how completely she had underestimated me. She leaned forward with an almost gentle smile and spoke the sentence that would stay with me forever. "We only kept you for the benefits." She actually smiled as she said it. Oddly enough, that smile became the moment I was finally set free. Cruelty wasn't new to me. I'd grown up with it. But smiling while delivering the most devastating sentence of someone's life required a level of rehearsal that stripped away every illusion I still carried. In that instant, I saw the truth with absolute clarity. I hadn't been a daughter who failed to meet their expectations. I had been an investment whose usefulness had expired. Benefits sounded like such a clean word for something so deeply ugly. My father, perhaps hoping to soften the damage, began explaining it like an accountant defending a financial report. He spoke about adoption subsidies they received when I was young, monthly assistance payments that ended during elementary school, tax advantages that followed, and finally my grandmother, though he never called her Nana. Instead, he explained that she had certain expectations about family, and adopting me had helped satisfy those expectations. According to him, meeting them had been, in his careful words, worthwhile for many years. I sat perfectly still while the mathematics of my childhood quietly rearranged itself into the truth. The lonely cupcake. The hand-me-down clothes from my cousin Brett with the original return tag still attached. The thermostat always turned down in my bedroom first. They hadn't been struggling financially. They had simply calculated the difference between what raising a child cost and what that child could bring them in return. I had never been their daughter in the way I believed. I had been the investment that generated the highest return. Then my father looked at me across the table and said the sentence that erased every remaining doubt. "We invested in you," he said, as though those 4 words explained everything, as though a child were nothing more than a rental property with a depreciation schedule. Before my father could continue his careful financial explanation, my mother interrupted, impatient with the bookkeeping and eager to deliver the sentence she had planned all evening. "The adoption subsidy ended years ago, Paige," she said calmly. "And today everything else ends too. You're 25 now. There's simply nothing left to gain by keeping you." She spoke with the detached disappointment of someone explaining that a coupon had expired. "You're not useful anymore." In just 2 sentences, she reduced 25 years of my life, the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet hope that maybe one day they'd love me, to an investment that had stopped producing returns. I reached for my glass of water. My hand didn't shake. I noticed the steadiness immediately and tucked that realization away like a small gift. Whatever happened next, they no longer had the power to break me. Then my father finally did what he'd really come to do. He opened the leather portfolio I'd assumed contained a birthday card and slowly slid a thin stack of legal papers across the white tablecloth until it rested against my dinner plate. "We've already filed everything," he said in the measured tone of someone reading from a prepared script. "You won't be included in our will. You won't inherit anything we own. We wanted to handle this face-to-face so there wouldn't be any confusion later." The word cleanly had clearly been rehearsed. I could almost hear the attorney who had coached him through every sentence. But here's the part my family has never understood, the moment that quietly changed the entire evening without me saying a single word. I glanced at the first page for barely 4 seconds, the same way I'd reviewed thousands of estate documents during my years as a paralegal, and instantly I saw their mistake. They had filed against the wrong legal instrument. They had spent time, money, and attorney fees cutting me out of an estate that was almost irrelevant, while leaving completely untouched the document that actually controlled everything. They believed all the power in that restaurant rested inside their modest will. They had aimed their expensive little knife at the wrong target because they didn't know what I already knew. They had no idea another document existed, one that carried far greater authority than anything sitting in that leather folder. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't correct a single misconception. In law, you never tell the other side they've built their entire case on the wrong foundation. You let them finish. So I gently pushed the papers an inch back toward the center of the table, neither accepting them nor refusing them, and allowed both of my parents to keep believing they had already won. Before either of my parents could say another word, my mother's purse lit up with an incoming call. She pressed the speaker button without hesitation, and my Aunt Renee's voice filled the silence. Of course she was listening. Renee had helped orchestrate half of this evening from the beginning. "Blood looks after blood, Paige," she said, her voice warm enough to sound kind and sharp enough to cut. "You've always understood that." I wish I could tell you I broke down, but I didn't. Part of me, the frightened 12-year-old who had believed Brett when he said I wasn't a real Mercer, had spent years expecting this exact moment. She had been waiting for this table, this speech, this rejection. But the woman sitting there at 25 simply lifted her water glass, took one slow sip, and placed it back on the table without making a sound. Then I saw something pass across my mother's face that I had never seen before. Disappointment. Not disappointment in me, disappointment in the performance. She had written this entire scene expecting a sobbing daughter, and the daughter refused to cry. Her perfect ending was falling apart. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked, her voice suddenly edged with frustration. The calm confidence she'd worn all evening was beginning to crack. I considered answering. 25 years of words pressed against the back of my throat, waiting to be released. But then she made the mistake people like her always make. She couldn't tolerate silence, so she reached for the line that had worked once already. Leaning forward, she repeated it more slowly, emphasizing every word as if she could wound me a second time. "We only kept you for the benefits." The strange thing about cruelty is that it loses its power once you've already survived it. The first time those words hit me, they shattered an illusion. The second time, they revealed only the person speaking them. It wasn't an indictment of my worth anymore. It was a confession of hers. I calmly adjusted the napkin in my lap, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care, and let her watch me remain completely unbroken. Behind her, at table 9, I noticed a woman with my exact chin and unmistakably familiar eyes slowly turn toward our conversation. The moment she saw me, she froze. To explain why she was sitting there, I have to take you back 6 months, to the week 2 envelopes arrived and quietly changed every equation of my life. The first was the one I'd waited years to receive. After Nana passed away, I finally registered with the state's adoption reunion program, convinced nothing would ever come of it. 8 weeks later, a letter arrived in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful looping script that looked as though every sentence had been practiced 100 times before it touched the page. It was from Susan Hale. She wrote that she had been only 19 when she gave birth to me. that giving me up had never been what she wanted, and that not a single March had passed in 25 years without her wondering where I was. She told me that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would drive any distance, on any day, asking for nothing except the chance to see me once. At the bottom, beneath her signature, she added one final sentence that I read so many times, the paper eventually softened beneath my fingers. I never stopped saving you a seat. 3 days later, a second envelope arrived. At first, I thought it had nothing to do with Susan at all. Our state had recently begun allowing adopted adults over 21 to obtain their original birth records through the same reunion registry, and I had submitted my request the very week Susan's letter arrived. While waiting for those documents, I also requested the public file related to Nana's estate, partly out of professional habit and partly because years of working in trusts and estates had taught me that the most important truths are often buried in paperwork everyone else forgets to read. I had no idea that those records would uncover a secret far bigger than my adoption itself. The answer was sitting exactly where I should have expected to find it, buried in paperwork. I read estate files the way a dentist studies x-rays, looking for tiny details everyone else overlooks. And there it was, hidden inside the distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust. Executed 2 years before Nana's death, and administered not by my parents, but by an independent corporate trustee, one paragraph changed everything. Caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remaining trust assets shall pass directly to my granddaughter, Paige Mercer. Not to my parents. Not through their estate. Not through their will. Directly to me, protected by a trust they could neither control nor alter. The transfer was scheduled for the exact date they had invited me to that birthday dinner. Suddenly, 2 envelopes received in the same week fit together like matching pieces of a puzzle. The first told me where I had come from. The second revealed why my parents had suddenly grown so cold. They weren't celebrating my 25th birthday. They were racing against a deadline. They knew the trust payments they'd been receiving for years were about to end, and once they did, everything that remained would legally become mine. I didn't call my mother to confront her. I didn't scream, accuse, or demand explanations. Outrage makes satisfying memories, but terrible legal strategy. After years of working in trusts and estates, I'd watched too many families destroy their strongest position with one emotional outburst that later became evidence in court. My advantage wasn't anger. It was preparation. So I took a personal day from work, gathered every relevant document, and drove them to an experienced estate attorney who had absolutely no connection to my family. I paid for the consultation from my own savings because I wanted an independent opinion. She confirmed exactly what I had already suspected. The caregiver payments to my parents were legitimate. They had been receiving monthly distributions from Nana's trust for nearly 2 decades to help raise me and maintain the family home. But those payments were designed to end automatically on my 25th birthday. On that day, under the trust's own terms, every remaining interest transferred directly to me through the corporate trustee. My parents couldn't stop it. They couldn't amend it, contest it, sign it away, or destroy it. Their carefully prepared will, the very document they proudly slid across the restaurant table, had absolutely no authority over the trust. Their dramatic disownment wasn't a legal victory. It was theater performed on the wrong stage. My attorney asked whether I wanted to warn them, give them time to process the truth, or soften what was coming. I quietly shook my head. No, I said. I only need 3 things in one folder. First, my attorney's signed retainer letter, so they'd know I already had legal representation. Second, the trust's official distribution schedule, with the transfer date printed clearly in black and white. And third, my original birth certificate, listing Susan Hale as my biological mother, because when the moment finally arrived, I wanted everyone sitting at that restaurant to understand exactly which family had rejected me, and exactly which family I had already found. I closed the folder, slipped it into my bag, and carried it with me for 6 months like a quiet engine waiting for the right moment to start. The dinner invitation didn't surprise me. It simply told me when to turn the key. During those same 6 months, I met her Susan Hale. For the first time at a small diner halfway between our cities, because she insisted I shouldn't have to drive the entire distance. That single act of consideration unraveled me more than any emotional speech ever could. She was nervous, constantly opening and closing an old photo album without quite finding the courage to show me its pages, as though she wasn't sure she had earned the right. She had my chin, my eyes, and the same habit of falling silent whenever emotions became too heavy for words. Slowly, over the next several months, we built something fragile and beautiful together. The way you repair a bridge while you're still standing on it. Through Susan, I discovered I had a 20-year-old half-brother named Danny. All awkward limbs, bad jokes, and endless curiosity. Within a week of meeting me, he was texting me ridiculous memes as if I'd been his sister his entire life. Then I met my birth grandmother, Pearl. A tiny woman with fierce eyes and a stronger spirit. She looked at me for exactly 1 second before smiling and saying, "Well, there she is." As though I had simply arrived late instead of disappearing for 25 years. What stunned me most wasn't who they were. It was what they never asked from me. They never wanted favors. They never hinted at money. They never expected gratitude or repayment. They simply wanted me. My entire nervous system struggled to understand that kind of love because I'd never experienced it before. During our third visit, Susan quietly said the sentence that would become the truest words I'd ever hear. "We've always kept a seat for you, sweetheart. We never gave it to anyone else." I had spent years drafting flawless legal documents that determined who belonged where after someone died. I understood every technical definition of inheritance, ownership, and family. Yet sitting across from my biological mother in that little diner, I suddenly realized I had no idea what to do with my own hands. For the first time in my life, I was wanted by people who gained absolutely nothing from wanting me. After 25 years of believing my value depended on being useful, I didn't know how to simply be welcome. There is an enormous difference between being needed and being wanted. I knew everything about being needed. Being needed is a job. You perform well. You stay quiet. You don't ask for too much. You keep life convenient for everyone else. And in return, you're allowed to keep your seat at the table a little longer. I had mistaken that arrangement for love because it was the only version I'd ever known. It was like confusing a daily commute with a destination simply because you traveled the same road every morning. What Susan, Danny, and Pearl offered me came with no conditions, no expectations, and no hidden invoice waiting at the end. Strangely, that terrified me far more than my adoptive mother's cruelty ever had. The first time Susan called simply to ask how my week had been, with no favor hidden beneath the conversation, no request quietly waiting at the end. I spent the entire call searching for the catch. When I realized there wasn't one, I had to pull my car onto the side of the road because tears blurred my vision so badly I couldn't safely drive. Even then, I kept testing them in ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel plans at the last minute just to see if they'd become angry or make me earn another invitation. They never did. They simply smiled and said, "No worries. We'll see you next time." And they meant every word. I'd insist on paying every restaurant bill because making myself useful still felt safer than simply accepting kindness. Finally, Pearl reached across the table, gently held my face in both hands, the exact way Nana Ruth used to, and smiled through tears. "You don't have to buy your way into this family," she whispered. "We already paid, with 25 years of waiting for you." Over those 6 months, something inside me slowly began to change. The knot I'd carried since I was 9 years old didn't disappear overnight, but it finally started to loosen. Little by little, I allowed myself to believe, despite 25 years of evidence to the contrary, that someone could simply want me in the room without expecting anything in return. So when my adoptive mother called and said she wanted to celebrate my 25th birthday properly, I already knew where I truly wanted to spend that evening. I simply decided to spend it in 2 places at once. The very night she booked a table at Van Ter, I called Susan. My voice shook as I asked the question I'd been too afraid to ask anyone my entire life. "Would you come to my birthday dinner?" Then I told her everything. The strange invitation, my suspicions, Nana's trust, the feeling that my parents had rehearsed a speech they intended to use to erase me. I admitted I didn't know exactly what they planned to say, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I didn't want to hear those words alone. I was done performing the heartbreak they expected from me. Susan didn't hesitate for even a heartbeat. "What time?" she asked warmly. "And where? Should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me cover my mouth just to keep myself from crying. "We'd be honored," she whispered, "to watch you discover you don't need them anymore." After we hung up, I made one final phone call. This time it was to Van Ter. I reserved a second table under my own name. Paige Mercer, party of 3. The hostess checked the reservations and smiled. "We have table 9 available," she said. "It's near the back of the dining room, about 3 tables behind another Mercer reservation already booked for the front." For a moment, I almost laughed at the perfect symmetry of it. My adoptive parents believed they were arranging the stage for my rejection. What they never realized was that only a few tables behind them sat the family that had spent 25 years waiting for me to come home, quietly saving me a seat the entire time. Told Susan and Pearl and Danny to arrive a little after us, to order quietly, to simply be there, and to let me come to them when I was ready. I won't pretend I didn't want them in that room. I did. There's a reason the truth lands harder when it's spoken in front of people than when it's mailed in a letter. And I'd watched enough confrontations to know a private one only ever becomes the other side's word against yours. So yes, I wanted witnesses, and I'm not ashamed of it. But Susan and Pearl and Danny were never just witnesses to me. And that was the whole difference between what they were doing and what my mother was doing. The folder was how I'd make my parents understand they'd lost. Table 9 was where I'd go to remember I'd won long before they sat down. Back at the front table, in the present, my mother decided the silence had gone on long enough and moved to close the deal. She produced one more page from the leather portfolio and turned it to face me, uncapping a pen and setting it across the paper like a small gift. "It's just an acknowledgement," she said, "that we've informed you that you understand the situation. Sign it, and we can all have a civilized dinner and go our separate ways." I looked at the page, and I didn't have to read far. The release paragraph opened with the exact boilerplate I'd typed 100 times myself. "The undersigned hereby waives and forever releases any claim, interest, or expectancy." And the rest of it did what that language always does. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a waiver wearing one. A tidy little document designed to have me agree, on the record, that I'd been notified and had no claim. The kind of thing a careful lawyer drafts to head off exactly the challenge I was in a position to bring. They wanted my signature while I was still bleeding from the reveal, before the shock wore off and I could think. It's a classic move. I've seen grieving people sign away fortunes at kitchen tables because someone slid the pen over at the right wounded moment. My mother was counting on my wound. She didn't know it had a trust attached to it. I left the pen where it lay. My father, across from me, kept glancing at my manila folder, and I watched the worry climb up his neck in a slow red tide. Wesley had always been the one who knew where the money actually lived. He'd seen the 4 letters on the tab. He was doing the arithmetic now, the same arithmetic I'd done 6 months before, and I could tell the answer was beginning to scare him. "Is there?" he started, then stopped. "Is there something we should know, Paige?" I smiled at him, the first real smile of the night. "Not yet," I said. That was when my Aunt Renee arrived in person, with Brett trailing behind her, both of them feigning the surprise of people who'd been waiting in the bar for a text. "Paige, what a coincidence," Renee said, pressing a cold cheek to mine. And I understood instantly that Diane had summoned reinforcements. My mother liked an audience for her best work, and she especially liked one that would nod along and apply pressure if I got difficult. Renee pulled up a chair without being asked. Brett, 26 and still dressing like his mother bought his clothes, gave me the look I'd been getting since we were children. The look that said I was always going to end up at the kids' table eventually. Renee got right to it, because subtlety was never her instrument. "We just want what's best for the family," she said, laying a manicured hand over my mother's. "And families have to make hard choices about who's really part of them. You've always been such a practical girl, Paige. You understand. That blood looks after blood." There it was again. That word. The one she'd been slipping into the group chat all year. Finally spoken out loud at the table it had been building toward. I looked at my aunt, who had answered for my mother the day I turned 8, and explained to a child why she wasn't worth a party, and I felt the last thread of obligation inside me go slack. These were not people I was losing. These were people I was setting down. I'd carried them a long way, longer than they deserved, and my arms were finally, gloriously tired. Across the table, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring at his hands. And then, while Renee was mid-sentence about the family's wishes, Wesley leaned toward me and said something quietly, just for me. "Your grandmother loved you," my father said, very quietly beneath Renee's chatter. He stopped there. For a moment, I saw the whole other version of Wesley Mercer, the one who might have existed if he'd ever once chosen a harder thing over a comfortable one. His eyes were wet. He'd loved his mother. I knew that much was true. And some part of him understood that the woman he loved had built a wall around me with her own money precisely because she didn't trust her son to protect me. That had to be a terrible thing to sit with at a dinner table. I waited. I genuinely waited because there was a version of that night where my father said the next sentence, the apology, the "I'm sorry. This is wrong. I won't do this." And I would have heard it. And it would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him the way a handler watches a dog that's wandered toward the road, and I saw him choose. He sat back. He picked up his water, and the almost sentence died in his throat, where so many of his almost sentences had died over the years. That was the closest thing to love anyone at the front table offered me all night, and it lasted 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't hate a man for being exactly the weight you always knew he was. But I understood, finally, that the reason they'd filed everything in such a hurry, the reason for the whole rushed, cruel evening, was sitting behind his wet eyes. He knew about Nana's trust. He'd known the date was coming, and he had hoped, desperately, to get my signature on a waiver before I ever found out what his mother had done for me. So I asked him a question. Not loudly, not as a daughter. I asked it in the voice I use at the firm when I've found the flaw in someone's filing and I'm giving them the dignity of noticing it themselves. "Dad," I said, "which instrument did you file under? Your estate or Nana's trust?" The table went quiet in a new way. My mother's wine glass paused on its way to her mouth. Renee's manicured hand stopped patting my mother's. Wesley blinked at me like I'd started speaking a language he half recognized from a country he'd never visited because, in 8 words, I'd told them 3 things they hadn't budgeted for. That I knew there was a difference between the two. That I knew which one mattered. And that I'd known long enough to learn the vocabulary by heart. My mother had never heard me use that voice before. None of them had. To them, I'd always been the quiet one, the easy one, the girl who took the smaller slice so the table could stay pleasant. They had built this entire evening on the assumption that I would receive my fate, not audit it. "What?" my mother said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to. "What are you talking about?" I let the question sit. I've learned that the most powerful thing in any room is the person who doesn't need to rush to the answer. I turned my water glass a quarter turn on the tablecloth, lined it up with the edge of the manila folder, and looked at my father, who had gone very pale and already knew, and who was silently begging me with his eyes not to open it. Then I opened it. I didn't make a show of it. There was no flourish, no slammed document, no speech. I simply turned the folder so it faced them, and I laid the 3 pages out on the white tablecloth, side by side, the way I'd lay exhibits in front of a client who needed to understand their own situation. The retainer letter came first, with the firm's letterhead and the unmistakable line confirming that I was represented by counsel. The distribution schedule of the Ruth Mercer Family Trust came second, with the relevant paragraph already there in black and white for anyone at the table to read. And third, my original birth certificate, with Susan Hale's name where my mother had assumed her own name belonged. I didn't point at anything. I let the paper do the work paper does. My mother's eyes went to the trust schedule first, because of course they did, because some animal part of her had always known where the money slept. I watched her read it. I watched the words sink in. The caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 25th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Paige. I watched her reach the words, remainder, and Paige, and I watched the color leave her face from the top down, like a window shade being drawn. She looked up at me, then at Wesley, and then back at the page, the way people do when they're hoping the second reading will say something kinder than the first. It didn't. It never does. "Mom," I said gently, because I could afford to be gentle now. "You filed against the wrong family. The one you cut me out of was always the smaller one." My mother was a fast woman, and I'll give her that. Even then, it took her about 10 seconds to assemble the full picture, and I watched her do it in real time. The house on Linden Road, funded by the trust she'd assumed she'd live in forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly furnished her comfortable life, and that stopped by their own terms that very night. The remainder, the real money, the part she'd spent 2 decades adjacent to but never controlling, passing on that exact date to the daughter she'd just told she was finished with. And the waiver, her clever little waiver that I'd been seconds from signing, would have been worth precisely nothing because it released a claim on an estate that was never where the value lived. She had aimed every weapon she owned at a will, and missed the trust entirely. The cruelty had been free. The mistake had been expensive. And here is where I learned the last thing my mother had to teach me, which is that people like her never apologize at the moment they're caught. They pivot. Her face rearranged itself, the cold draining out and a terrible warmth flooding in. Then she reached across the table for my hand. "Paige," she said, and her voice had gone soft and wet and maternal, in a way it had never once been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever's in those papers, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." The word, family, coming from the mouth that, minutes earlier, she'd said, "We only kept you for the benefits." I looked at her hand reaching for mine, and I did not take it. The same sentence that had been her weapon was now, in this light, the confession that cleared me to leave. People expect this is the part where I made them pay, where I detailed exactly what the remainder was worth, watched them squirm, maybe ordered the most expensive thing on the menu and left them the bill. I understand the appetite for it. I've felt it. But I want to tell you the truth about power, because I handle it for a living. The strongest position in any room isn't the one holding the biggest number. It's the one that doesn't need the number at all. I had a career I'd built with my own hands. I had savings I'd earned waiting tables and drafting documents. I did not need Nana's remainder to be free. And that, more than any dollar figure, was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the 3 pages back into it, unhurried, and I kept the pen they had brought for my surrender and set it neatly beside her plate. I'd won the thing they thought we were fighting over before any of them sat down, and I'd won it by knowing, by preparing, by refusing to be ambushed. There was nothing left to argue. There was only the choice of where to spend the rest of my birthday. And I'd made that choice 6 months earlier in a vinyl diner booth when a nervous woman with my chin slid a photo album across the table and didn't ask me for a single thing. I administer estates for a living, and I'll tell you what I tell every client who's being circled by people who only appear when there's something to gain. If someone in your life shows up only when you're useful, you already know what that is, and no amount of shared history makes it love. Type the word boundaries 1 below if you've had to learn that the hard way. And subscribe because the part you came for is about to happen. I stood up. I did it the way you'd rise from any table. No drama, just a woman pushing her chair back and reaching for her folder. But the effect on the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she said, and the soft maternal mask slipped, and the old cold control snapped back into her voice like a bone setting. "Sit down, Paige. Where on earth do you think you're going?" Renee straightened. Brett, for once, stopped smirking. My father just looked tired, the look of a man watching the only good thing his mother ever did walk out of his reach forever. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest. Then I looked at my mother, who had spent 25 years and an expensive dinner trying to make me understand that I had no real place anywhere. And I told her where I was going in the plainest words I owned. "My birth family is sitting 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. The sentence had been true for the entire meal, true while she smiled, rehearsed her speech, and slid her waiver across the tablecloth. It had been true the whole time. She believed she was performing my disownment in front of a room full of strangers. She wasn't. She had been performing it within arm's reach of the people who had been saving me a seat since long before she decided I had stopped being useful. I watched my words travel across the table and land. Then I watched my mother begin, very slowly, to turn around in her chair. She turned the way someone turns when a part of them already knows the truth, and the rest is desperately hoping to be wrong. The gray cashmere on her shoulders shifted first. Then her chin followed. And there, at table 9, 3 tables behind us, beneath the warm, low restaurant lights, sat Susan, Pearl, and Danny. They had been there the entire time. They had ordered quietly, eaten almost nothing, and watched my mother deliver the cruelest sentences of my life. They had stayed in their seats, calm and composed, because I had asked them to let me come to them when I was ready. Susan met my mother's eyes first. She didn't glare. She didn't smirk. She didn't celebrate. She simply looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator. Then she looked at me, and her whole face opened with a warmth that felt like spring after a very long winter. Pearl, small and fierce as ever, already had her napkin folded neatly beside her plate, ready to leave the moment I reached them. Danny had stopped pretending to scroll through his phone. My mother's eyes moved from Susan's face to mine, then back again, quietly doing the resemblance math, and I saw the exact second she understood. The family she had just told me I didn't have was sitting barely 15 feet behind her, at a real table, in real chairs, after hearing every word she had spoken. They had witnessed the one thing she could never take back. She slowly turned back toward me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script, and in the silence where her next cruel line should have been, a chair scraped softly against the floor at table 9. All 3 of them stood, not to make a scene, not to confront anyone, but simply to be on their feet when I walked across the room to them. The way people stand when someone they love finally arrives home after a very long journey. Pearl stood first, because Pearl always did. Pearl does everything first. Then Susan stood, followed by Danny, who knocked his knee against the table leg in his hurry. None of them said a single word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their standing said everything. The restaurant had fallen quiet around us. The particular hush of strangers who can feel that something true is happening and stop pretending not to watch. A waiter froze with a tray in his hands, and I walked past my mother, who was still half turned in her chair. Past Renee, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood. Past my father, who lifted his eyes to meet mine as I passed, then lowered them again, choosing comfort one last time. 15 feet, 3 tables, 25 years. When I reached them, Pearl took my face in both her hands the way Nana used to. Susan pulled out the empty chair beside her own, the 4th chair, the one they had asked the host to set, even though their reservation had only been for 3. Then she said the words she had written beneath her name in that very first letter, the words that had gone soft from how many times I had read them. "We saved you a seat," she said quietly. "We always did." And I sat down in it, the seat that had been waiting for me my whole life, at the table that had wanted me long before it knew whether I would ever come. That was the moment my mother lost the one thing she had never lost in public, her composure. I heard her chair scrape across the floor. I heard her stand. I heard the calm mask she had worn all evening crack straight down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she shouted, and her voice was no longer quiet. It carried across the dining room, sharp and rising. "After everything we did for you, the schools, the roof, the years. You do this to us? You humiliate your family over money?" Heads turned openly now. A man at the bar slowly set down his drink. Renee grabbed at my mother's sleeve, hissing, "Diane, sit down. People are looking." But my mother had moved beyond even her own handler for the first time in her life, because the script was gone, and all she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she cried to a room full of strangers, and I noticed she said gave, not loved. Even then, even cornered, the word love would not come because it had never been part of the inventory. I stayed seated at table 9. I didn't stand to match her. I didn't raise my voice to compete with hers. Susan's hand found mine beneath the table, and I simply held it, letting my mother be loud because her loudness was doing my work for me. Every person in that restaurant could see the same picture. A calm young woman sitting quietly with people who clearly adored her, and a furious older woman shouting about everything she had paid for. There isn't a person alive who hears a parent screaming about money and thinks, "There's the real family." My father never stood at all. He simply lowered his face into his hands. I let her run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. And when the silence finally returned, I did one last thing before giving the rest of my attention to my actual family. I stood, walked the 3 tables back to the front, and placed a single page on the white tablecloth in front of her, the trust's distribution schedule. I left it face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals, and I wanted my mother to have something to read on the longest evening of her life. "You can keep this one," I said. "You'll want to understand what ended today, and what didn't." She stared at the page. Wesley reached for it, then stopped. I looked at the 2 of them. My mother, who had priced me at 1 candle, and my father, who had loved his own mother too much to honor what she had asked of him. Then I said the only sentence I had prepared in advance, the one I'd written over and over in my head while sitting in the parking lot, promising myself I'd only say it if I earned it. "You kept me for the benefits," I said quietly. "They kept a seat for me." Then I turned around, walked back to table 9, and never looked behind me again. Not once. Not when Renee called my name. Not when my mother shouted something I couldn't hear, and no longer wanted to. I sat back down beside Susan. While I had been gone, Pearl had ordered me a slice of chocolate cake, and Danny had placed a single restaurant candle in the center of it. It was lit. For one brief moment, the symmetry of it caught in my throat. Then Susan leaned toward me and whispered, "Blow it out, sweetheart. Make a wish." And I realized I didn't have one. I already had everything I had wished for. The trust did exactly what my grandmother had designed it to do. On my 25th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Wesley and Diane Mercer ended exactly on schedule, under the terms Nana had notarized 2 years before she died. The remainder passed directly to me through the corporate trustee, untouched by the will my parents had spent so much time and money rewriting, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you do not control. Their unsigned waiver was worth exactly what it had always been worth: nothing. Within a year, my parents sold the house on Linden Road because, without the trust distributions, they could no longer afford to keep it. They moved into a much smaller place. I later heard that Renee was furious when she realized none of Nana's money would ever be flowing toward Brett after all. The story of that dinner spread the way family stories always do. First through the relatives, then far beyond them. But the version where Diane Mercer was the devoted mother betrayed by an ungrateful adopted daughter never quite took hold. Too many strangers at Van Ter had watched a woman scream about everything she had paid for while a quiet young woman sat across the room, holding hands with the family that had simply been waiting for her all along. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't post anything online. I simply stopped answering, and I let the silence become the boundary. Because that's the only kind of boundary that ever truly holds. My father texted me once a few weeks later. 3 words, "I am sorry." No signature, no explanation, no follow-up. I never replied. Later, I heard that when Renee tried to rally the family to contest Nana's trust, it was Wesley who quietly shut it down. He told them their mother had every right to leave her money wherever she pleased, that it was hers, and that the matter was finished. He was right. He was also, as always, a year too late, and saying it in the wrong room, at a time when it cost him nothing and changed nothing. That, in the end, was the whole of my father. A man who knew the right thing, even felt it, but could only bring himself to do it after doing the right thing no longer required any courage. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad it came. In a small, quiet way, I was grateful he had finally spoken the truth out loud. As for the rest of my life, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 9 with people who got nothing from wanting me, and I've spent every birthday since with them. Susan and I talk every Sunday now at 4 o'clock, the same hour I used to save for Nana. Pearl taught me how to make her grilled cheese. Danny still sends me ridiculous memes, and somewhere in a drawer in my new family's kitchen sits a photo album that no longer closes properly because it finally has enough pages. Being useful was all my parents ever wanted from me. Being wanted was the one thing I'd never had. And it took me 25 years and one terrible dinner to understand that anyone who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, in the plainest language possible, that they were never truly your family at all. That's my story. 1 candle for 24 years. And on the 25th, a whole table that lit them all without ever being asked. If someone in your life only values you when you're useful, let this be your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You don't have to earn the people who genuinely love you. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.